This is the first of two parts discussing how to deal with delivering content based on the user's language, whether English, French, German, so on, as well as their country. So, for example, English US versus English UK, French France versus French Canada, and so on. All right. So this lesson is going to discuss simply how to create and access values in a resource file. And then in the next lesson, we'll look at how to localize the resource files for specific languages and cultures. So tune in to the next video as well. And a caveat before we begin, I'm going to show you the easiest way to work with resource files in this lesson and the next lesson. But there's a little gotcha there. If you work with resource files like I'm going to demonstrate, then your ASP.NET MVC application will not be unit testable, at least not the controllers won't be unit testable. And there's a technical reason for this. The resource files that we'll create will actually be creating classes, and those classes will be defined in their own assembly, and those assemblies are accessed by the views, but they're not accessed by the controllers in the internals of ASP.NET MVC. So if you try to unit test the values of a resource file, it's just going to blow up. And there are workarounds for this online. They require a little bit more effort, and since this is a fundamental series, I decided to just show you the basics, and then you can make the decision if you want to unit test. Then you can look online for some implementations for advanced use cases, and they'll be written by people that are much more knowledgeable about this sort of thing than I am. Hopefully this will get you pointed in the right direction though. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. What is a resource file? It's simply an XML file that contains strings that you want to translate ultimately into different languages. Those strings might also contain paths to stuff like files or like images. So for English US, you might want to display one version of an image. For English UK, you might want to display a different version of the image, or for different languages, you might want to display different images. All right. So it's for resource files are for changing some of the specifics of the text and the images that are being displayed to the end user. Okay. Now, a resource file will contain a key value pair. Each pair is an individual resource. And so we'll be creating some resources here in just a moment. To do that, we're going to, first of all, create a folder, a special kind of folder called the app_global resources folder. So select your project name in the Solution Explorer, and then we want to add an ASP.NET folder, app global resources right there. Now you might be wondering what's the difference between the global resources and the local resources. We'll talk about that in the next lesson. Okay, let's create that. All right, so this is actually a folder, but in my version of Visual Studio it shows up as an image. It's a little bit strange. Don't be put off by that. We're going to add a resource file to that folder-ish looking thing. So let's go back to project with making sure that's selected in the Solution Explorer, and then we're going to add a new item and make sure it's a resource file. So it'll have a .resx file extension, and ultimately we're going to use this this resource file to contain error messages. So we might call it something like error message resources. We can call it anything we want. We can call it Jim if we want to. Okay. All right, and it opens up a beautiful designer that allows us to add names and values instead of having to type in XML. It also allows us to type in some comments about what we were intending to use that particular resource for. So it already gives us a sample key. Let's give it a sample value. This is a resource, like so. Okay, and now all we need to do is access that and display it to an end user. There's two different ways we're going to demonstrate. The first way is really easy. Let's open up our views, the home controller views, and go to the index view. And under the H2 title, I'm going to put in header 4 title, and I'm going to access a static object called resources. And this will give us access to the namespace of our resource file. So in this case, a class was created for us behind the scenes called error message resources. So I should be able to access error message resources, sources. And then I can also access any of the keys that I created. I only created one, the string one, so we'll just use that. But the IntelliSense at least tells me that it's seeing everything, so that should be a good sign. All right, so now let's go ahead and run the application. And again, this is the most simple use case. We're able to grab a value out of a resource file and display it into our view using the static resources object and some Razor syntax. All right. Now that's one way to do it. The other way is to add data annotations in our view model to pull certain resources for things like the display name or the error message, and we'll do both here. So let's open up our error message resources.resx file, and we want to add two more resources. The first one will be called the release date display, and so this is what I want displayed everywhere that the release date property of a product model will be displayed, whether it's in an edit screen or in a list. And I'll just call this, instead of release date, date of release, like so. And then I'll also want to add a resource string for the required field error message. So if you don't type in a release date, I want this to be displayed as the error message. So we'll call this release date required error message, like so, and we'll just give it a error message. Please supply a valid date of release. All right. Now, how do we use these? Well, we'll use data annotations on our view model. So let's close that up. Let's go to our models and open up our product.cs. And here's the target of our affection, the release date property. And so I'm going to add a display annotation, and I need to give it two things. I need to give it what's the name of the class, or rather the resource file that I want to look inside of, and then what's the key name that I want to look inside of. All right, so first we'll give it the type. What is it called again? Yeah, resource type equals, and then we'll give it a type of, and then whatever our class name is. Should be error message resources. All right, we'll get a red squiggly line. That's okay. We'll come back to that in a moment. We also want to give it the key name. So that should be name equals, and what do we call that? The release date display, like so. Now let's go ahead and hit Control period on that red squiggly. All we needed to do is add that resources namespace class, I don't know what you call it, to our file. Once we do that, it should see the error message resources, and all should be good. All right, what I'm going to do now is get rid of the webcam, because I actually need the properties window here in just a moment, and I just need to remind myself of that. All right. Unfortunately, that made my screen go up a little bit. All right, that should work. Great. Okay, so now we're going to run the application, and I anticipate that we're going to get an error, a runtime error. Yeah, and the error is cannot retrieve the property name because localization failed. Type resources error message resources not public, or doesn't display a public static string property with the name release date display. All right. Now this is somewhat related to the little caveat that I gave here at the beginning. In a nutshell here, let me stop the execution of this. Whenever we're working inside of this designer, you got to know that something's going on behind the scenes. It's actually creating a strongly typed class called error message resources, and it creates static properties like string1, like release date required error message, like release date display. Okay, so it's great that it's generating all of these methods for us. Problem is they're all internal, which means we can't get to them. Ideally, these would be public. So maybe we can go to the resource designer and change the access modifier, but alas, it's not available to change. Bummer. What has to happen is that we need to select the resource file in the Solution Explorer and then go down here to the Properties window. And there's two things we need to change. There's a custom tool that actually generates this class based on what we type into the Resource Designer. By default, they give you this global resource proxy generator, but we need to use a different code generator that will essentially do the same thing, but we want it to create public properties instead of internal ones. So we're going to use one, I just pasted it in, called public resx file code generator. All right. The next thing we need to do is change the build action from content to embedded resource. We'll save this, shut all this stuff down, and I'm going to build this to make sure it works. It won't work. Why? Because back here in our products class, we have a using on the resources. That's now gone. That resources class has been eliminated because it no longer exists in this error message resources designer.cs. All right. What does exist, as we'll see as we put our mouse cursor on the error message and then hit control period, is that there's a new namespace called resource file example.app_global resources. That's what we want. Okay, that should work. All right, you might say, well, this is a lot of effort. Really, once you wrap your head around it, it's not that big of a deal. Okay. So now you see that everywhere you see the release date, it's now using the term date of release. Even in the edit screen, date of release, even in the delete screen. Okay, date of release. Doesn't show it though. Okay. All right, so that's the first part. Let's go back to the camera and we'll pull this back up here. Great. Now that we got all that working, let's focus on how we utilize this other resource that we created. Let's go back to the product definition. Here I'm going to put things on separate lines just so they're a little more obvious. And I'm going to create another annotation. This one will be called the required annotation. And we're going to need to do essentially the same thing. Well, first of all, let me go allow empty strings equals false. Okay. Then what I want to do is give it the type. So error message resource type equals, and then type of, and then error message resources. Great, great, great. And then we want to give it the key name. So that would be error message resource name equals, and that would be what? Release date required error message, right? Great. Let me put these on separate lines again for readability's sake. All right, good. Now, whenever we run the application, and we go to create a new product, and we give it some junk, and we leave the release date unpopulated, and I hit the create button, we'll get the error message, please supply a valid date of release. All right, so yeah, there's a little workaround. We have to work by modifying some properties of our resource file, but it's really a small matter. In the next lesson, we're going to look at how to take this to the next level and allow ASP.NET MVC to choose the language and the culture based on where the user is coming from. So that'll be exciting. We'll see you in the next lesson. Thanks.